The moment the bank manager slid the foreclosure notice across her mahogany desk, I knew my twin sister Isabella had finally crossed a line she could never uncross. What she didn't know was that I'd been tracking her every move for 3 months, documenting each fraudulent transaction, each forged signature, each lie told in my name. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. While she thought she was living my dream life in Seattle, I was quietly building a case that would not only expose her crimes, but leave her trapped in a financial nightmare of her own making. The briefcase at my feet didn't contain the desperate pleas for mercy she expected. It held a complete identity swap that would make everything she'd stolen legally hers, including the crushing debt she'd accumulated in my name. I still remember the exact moment my carefully constructed life began unraveling, though at the time I had no idea the devastation had been orchestrated by the person who shared my DNA. It was a gray Tuesday morning in October, the kind of Portland drizzle that makes you grateful for coffee shops on every corner. I'd arrived early at Northwest Marketing Solutions, where I worked as a senior creative director, planning to finalize the campaign proposal that could earn me the promotion I'd been working toward for 3 years. My assistant Riley knocked on my office door with an expression I'd never seen before, somewhere between confusion and concern. She held a manila envelope that had been hand-delivered that morning, marked urgent and confidential. I assumed it was materials from a prospective client, perhaps someone wanting to make a dramatic impression with their presentation. The reality was far more dramatic than any marketing stunt I could have imagined. Inside the envelope were bank statements from accounts I'd never opened, credit card bills for purchases I'd never made, and a lease agreement for a luxury apartment in Seattle that bore my signature, but described a life I'd never lived. The amounts were staggering. $60,000 in credit card debt spread across 7 different cards, a lease for a downtown Seattle penthouse at $4,000 monthly, auto loans for a BMW and a Mercedes, both registered in my name. The financial obligations detailed in those documents represented more money than I made in 2 years. My first instinct was to call the bank immediately, certain there had been some clerical error, a case of mistaken identity that could be resolved with a simple phone call. Patricia Wells, the branch manager at Pacific Northwest Credit Union, where I'd banked for 8 years, scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon. Her tone carried a gravity that made my stomach twist with apprehension I couldn't yet justify. The bank's conference room felt sterile and intimidating as Patricia spread additional documents across the polished table. Security camera footage, transaction records, even voice recordings from phone calls made to customer service. Each piece of evidence painted an increasingly impossible picture. Someone who looked exactly like me, sounded exactly like me, and knew intimate details about my life had been systematically accessing my accounts and establishing new ones for months. The recordings were the most unsettling evidence. I listened to my own voice, or what sounded precisely like my own voice, confidently providing my social security number, mother's maiden name, and even details about my first pet that only family members would know. The caller discussed plans to relocate to Seattle for a new job opportunity, explaining the need for increased credit limits and new account access. The conversation sounded natural, unrehearsed, delivered with the same slight, vocal inflections I recognized from my own speech patterns. Patricia's expression reflected the same bewilderment I felt. In her 15 years of banking, she'd never encountered identity theft of this sophistication. The perpetrator hadn't just stolen account numbers or personal information. They had somehow replicated my entire identity so convincingly that even experienced bank employees had been completely deceived during in-person transactions. Security footage showed a woman who could have been my identical twin conducting business with my accounts, signing documents with handwriting that matched my signature on file. The most chilling detail emerged when Patricia showed me the address, change requests that had been submitted 3 months earlier. All my financial institutions had been contacted by someone claiming to be me, explaining a temporary relocation to Seattle for work purposes. Mail forwarding had been established, ensuring that all statements and notices would be directed away from my actual address. The systematic nature of these changes suggested careful planning rather than opportunistic theft. Driving home from the bank in a state of shocked numbness, I tried to construct logical explanations for what I'd discovered. Professional identity thieves had become increasingly sophisticated, but the level of personal detail required for this deception seemed beyond what any stranger could acquire. The voice recordings particularly troubled me. Voice cloning technology existed, but creating something so convincing would require extensive audio samples and technical expertise that seemed unlikely for typical financial fraud. The possibility that began forming in my mind felt too devastating to acknowledge directly, but the evidence pointed towards someone with intimate access to my personal information, someone who could replicate not just my appearance, but my mannerisms, speech patterns, and family history. Someone who had grown up in the same household, attended the same schools, shared the same memories and experiences that formed the foundation of security questions and personal verification methods. That evening, I sat in my small apartment in the Pearl District, staring at copies of the fraudulent documents while trying to remember the last time I'd spoken with Isabella. We'd never been particularly close despite being twins, our personalities diverging significantly during adolescence. She'd always been more impulsive, more willing to take risks, while I preferred careful planning and gradual progress toward my goals. Our mother Carmen frequently commented on how different we'd become despite sharing identical DNA. Isabella had moved to Los Angeles after college, claiming to pursue opportunities in the entertainment industry. Our conversations had become increasingly infrequent over the past 2 years, limited to brief holiday phone calls and occasional social media interactions. She'd mentioned struggling financially, working various temporary jobs while auditioning for roles that never materialized. During our last conversation 6 months earlier, she'd sounded particularly frustrated about her career prospects and mounting expenses. The timeline aligned uncomfortably with the beginning of the fraudulent activity. If Isabella was indeed responsible for this elaborate deception, she'd been planning and executing it for months while maintaining the facade of normal sibling communication. The sophistication required for such a scheme suggested she'd invested considerable time and effort into studying my habits, my speech patterns, even my financial behaviors. Sleep eluded me that night as I mentally cataloged all the personal information Isabella would have access to from our shared childhood. She knew our mother's maiden name, the name of our first pet, the street where we'd grown up, and countless other details that formed the backbone of financial security protocols. More troubling, she possessed intimate knowledge of my personality, my communication style, and my typical responses to various situations. If she was indeed impersonating me, she could do so with a level of authenticity that would be virtually impossible to detect. The following morning brought a call from James Carter, a credit counselor whose name I didn't recognize. He explained that he'd been working with me for several weeks to consolidate the significant debt I'd accumulated and establish a manageable repayment plan. According to his records, we'd had multiple phone conversations about my financial situation and my desire to resolve these obligations before they damaged my credit rating permanently. The conversation revealed additional layers to the deception. Isabella, if it was indeed her, hadn't simply been accumulating debt carelessly. She'd been actively working to manage the financial damage, creating the appearance of someone genuinely committed to resolving their obligations. This strategic approach suggested she'd been planning either to eventually pay off the debt or to maintain the deception long enough to avoid immediate consequences. James mentioned that during our previous conversations, I'd explained my situation as resulting from a period of poor financial decisions following a difficult breakup and job loss. The story was plausible and personal enough to discourage detailed questioning while providing context for the financial difficulties. The narrative, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how to present financial problems in a way that generated sympathy rather than suspicion. I scheduled a meeting with James for the following day, claiming I needed to review all the documentation and ensure we were on the same page regarding the repayment strategy. His office was located in downtown Portland, close enough to my workplace, that I could meet with him during my lunch break without arousing suspicion among my colleagues about my personal financial crisis. Meanwhile, I began conducting my own investigation into Isabella's current activities. Her social media presence had become increasingly sparse over the past few months, with only occasional posts that could have been made from anywhere. Her last Instagram post, dated 3 weeks earlier, showed a coffee cup against a blurred urban background with a caption about new chapters and fresh starts. The image could have been taken in any major city, providing no concrete evidence of her actual location. I called our mother Carmen, carefully crafting questions that would reveal Isabella's recent activities without explaining my suspicions. Carmen mentioned that Isabella had been less communicative lately, claiming to be busy with new opportunities that she preferred not to discuss in detail. She'd canceled her planned visit home for our birthday in September, citing work commitments that couldn't be rescheduled. Carmen had found this disappointing, but not particularly unusual, given Isabella's historically unpredictable schedule. The conversation with our mother revealed another troubling detail. Isabella had called several weeks earlier asking about family financial history, claiming she was applying for a loan and needed to verify certain information. She'd asked specific questions about our childhood addresses, Carmen's employment, history, and even details about our deceased father's military service. At the time, Carmen had found the questions reasonable and had provided the information without suspicion. This revelation confirmed that Isabella had been systematically gathering the personal details necessary to convincingly impersonate me with financial institutions. The premeditated nature of her information gathering suggested she'd been planning this deception for considerably longer than the 3 months since the fraudulent activity began. She'd likely spent additional time studying my habits, practicing my speech patterns, and developing the confidence necessary to carry out such an elaborate fraud. That afternoon's meeting with James Carter provided additional insight into the scope of Isabella's deception. She'd presented herself as a responsible debtor genuinely committed to resolving financial difficulties, complete with a detailed budget and realistic timeline for debt repayment. The documentation she'd provided included employment verification from a marketing firm in Seattle, salary information that aligned with industry standards, and even references who could vouch for her character and reliability. The employment verification particularly concerned me. If Isabella had managed to secure actual employment using my identity, the implications extended far beyond financial fraud into potential tax fraud, employment fraud, and numerous other serious crimes. The Seattle address on the employment documentation matched the luxury apartment lease I'd discovered in the bank statements, suggesting she'd created an entire false life in my name. James showed me copies of the financial documentation Isabella had provided, including bank statements that appeared to show steady income and responsible spending habits. The statements were sophisticated forgeries, or possibly legitimate documents from accounts she'd opened using my identity. Either possibility demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication that went far beyond typical identity theft into the realm of organized fraud. I excused myself from the meeting, claiming I needed to review the information more carefully before proceeding with any repayment agreements. James seemed understanding, noting that financial stress could be overwhelming, and that taking time to make informed decisions was always advisable. His patience suggested that Isabella had established herself as a thoughtful, deliberate person, rather than someone desperate or unreliable. Walking back to my office, I felt the weight of the situation settling around me like a suffocating blanket. If my suspicions were correct, my twin sister had stolen not just my financial identity, but had created an entirely fabricated version of my life in another city. She was living in luxury using credit extended in my name while I faced the prospect of financial ruin for crimes I hadn't committed. The emotional betrayal felt almost as devastating as the financial implications. Isabella and I had grown apart over the years, but I'd never imagined she was capable of such calculated deception. The planning required for this scheme suggested months of deliberate preparation, during which she'd maintained normal sibling communication while systematically gathering the information necessary to destroy my financial stability. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That evening, I began documenting everything I'd discovered, creating a detailed timeline of events and maintaining copies of all fraudulent documents. If I was going to prove Isabella's guilt and clear my name, I needed to approach this situation with the same methodical planning she'd apparently used to create it. The stakes were too high for emotional responses or hasty decisions that might compromise my ability to expose her crimes. I also began researching the legal implications of identity theft between family members. The laws regarding financial fraud applied regardless of the relationship between perpetrator and victim, but prosecuting a family member added emotional complications that could affect my willingness to pursue criminal charges. For now, I focused on gathering evidence and understanding the full scope of the damage she'd caused. The investigation that began that day would reveal layers of deception I couldn't have imagined, ultimately leading to a confrontation that would expose not just Isabella's crimes, but her true character. What I discovered about my twin sister, in the weeks that followed, would forever change my understanding of family loyalty, personal boundaries, and the length some people will go to escape the consequences of their own choices. But first, I needed to verify my suspicions beyond any reasonable doubt. If I was going to accuse my twin sister of systematic identity theft, I needed evidence that would stand up to legal scrutiny and family interrogation. The financial documents were compelling, but I needed proof that Isabella was actually in Seattle, living the life she'd created using my stolen identity. The search for that proof would take me down a path I never could have anticipated, revealing not just Isabella's location, but the elaborate network of lies she'd constructed to support her deception. Each discovery would make me more determined to not only expose her crimes, but to ensure she faced consequences that matched the magnitude of her betrayal. Little did I know that the evidence I was gathering would eventually become the foundation for a plan that would turn Isabella's own deception against her in ways she never could have anticipated. While she thought she was safely hidden in Seattle, living my life and spending my credit, I was quietly building a case that would ultimately leave her trapped in the very prison she'd tried to create for me. The next morning, I called in sick to Northwest Marketing Solutions for the first time in 3 years. Riley expressed genuine concern when I told her I was fighting a severe migraine, asking if she should reschedule my afternoon presentation with the Morrison Group. I assured her I'd be fine by tomorrow, knowing that what I was about to undertake would require my complete focus and couldn't be interrupted by client meetings or creative deadlines. My first stop was the downtown office of Michael Harrison, a criminal defense attorney who specialized in white-collar crimes. I'd found his name through online research the previous evening, drawn to his reputation for handling complex fraud cases and his straightforward approach to client consultations. His secretary squeezed me in for an emergency appointment after I explained that I was the victim of ongoing identity theft that required immediate legal intervention. Harrison's office occupied the 23rd floor of a glass tower overlooking the Willamette River, its floor-to-ceiling windows providing a panoramic view of Portland's skyline. The attorney himself was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of sharp intensity that suggested he took financial crimes personally. He listened without interruption as I outlined my discovery, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished my explanation, Harrison leaned back in his leather chair and studied me with calculating eyes. "The evidence you've described suggests systematic identity theft rather than opportunistic fraud," he observed. "The level of personal information required, and the sophisticated nature of the scheme indicate someone with intimate knowledge of your life and habits. Have you considered who might have access to this information? I hesitated before answering, still reluctant to voice my suspicions about Isabella aloud. Speaking them would make them real in a way that felt irreversible. The most logical suspect would be someone in my immediate family, I admitted carefully. Someone who shares my physical appearance and has grown up with access to all the personal details that form the foundation of identity verification. Harrison nodded knowingly. Family. Member fraud is more common than most people realize, and it's often the most devastating because the victims hesitate to pursue prosecution. The emotional complications can prevent people from taking the necessary legal steps to protect themselves. He opened a desk drawer and removed a standard legal contract. If we're going to proceed, I need you to understand that gathering evidence of identity theft, even by a family member, may ultimately require criminal charges to resolve fully. The weight of his words settled heavily in the room. I'd been focused on proving Isabella's guilt and clearing my name, but I hadn't fully considered the final implications of success. If my investigation confirmed that my twin sister had indeed stolen my identity, I would face the choice between family loyalty and legal justice. Harrison seemed to recognize my internal struggle and gave me time to process the decision. I signed the retainer agreement after asking about the scope of investigation he could provide. Harrison explained that his firm worked with several licensed private investigators who specialized in financial fraud cases. They could conduct surveillance, verify employment claims, and gather photographic evidence that would be admissible in court proceedings. The cost would be significant, but the alternative was facing financial ruin for crimes I hadn't committed. Robert Kim, the private investigator Harrison recommended, met me at a small coffee shop in the Alberta district. 2 hours later. He was a compact man in his 50s with the observational intensity of someone accustomed to noticing details others missed. His background included 15 years with the Portland Police Bureau's fraud division before starting his own investigation company specializing in white-collar crimes. Kim listened to my story with professional detachment, asking precise questions about timeline, documentation, and my sister's known associates. He requested recent photographs of Isabella, which I provided from my phone's social media screenshots. The physical resemblance between us was immediately obvious, even to someone meeting me for the first time. Kim noted that identity theft between identical twins presented unique challenges for detection and prosecution. The investigation plan Kim outlined was comprehensive and methodical. He would begin by verifying Isabella's presence in Seattle through surveillance of the luxury apartment address listed on the fraudulent lease. If she was indeed living there, he would document her daily activities, employment situation, and any evidence of her using my identity for ongoing transactions. The process would require several days of observation to establish patterns and gather compelling photographic evidence. Kim also proposed investigating the employment verification documents Isabella had provided to the credit counselor. If she was indeed working at a Seattle marketing firm using my credentials, this represented additional serious crimes beyond financial fraud. Employment fraud carried separate penalties and could complicate any eventual plea negotiations if criminal charges were filed. While Kim began his Seattle investigation, I focused on gathering additional evidence from Portland. My next stop was the Pacific Northwest Credit Union's main branch, where Patricia Wells had arranged for me to meet with their fraud investigation specialist. Linda Brooks had worked in banking security for over a decade and had seen identity theft cases ranging from simple check fraud to elaborate schemes involving multiple false identities. Linda explained that the sophistication of the fraud in my case suggested either professional criminal experience or extensive preparation time. The systematic approach to changing addresses, establishing new accounts, and maintaining existing credit lines required careful coordination and detailed knowledge of banking procedures. Most importantly, the perpetrator had avoided the common mistakes that typically exposed identity thieves within weeks of beginning their schemes. The security footage Linda showed me was both revealing and disturbing. The woman conducting transactions with my accounts was clearly not me, despite the remarkable physical similarity. Her mannerisms were subtly different, her clothing style more expensive and fashionable than my typical professional attire. Most telling were her confident interactions with bank staff, suggesting someone comfortable with deception rather than nervous about discovery. Linda provided me with copies of all transaction records, signature cards, and security footage related to the fraudulent accounts. She also explained the bank's internal process for handling identity theft cases, which would require filing formal fraud claims and cooperating with law enforcement if criminal charges were pursued. The documentation she provided would be crucial evidence if the investigation led to prosecution. That afternoon, I visited the Seattle apartment complex listed on Isabella's lease agreement. The drive from Portland took 3 hours, giving me time to mentally prepare for what I might discover. Riverside Gardens Apartments was exactly the kind of luxury development Isabella had always coveted, but never been able to afford. The building featured floor-to-ceiling windows, granite countertops, and amenities that commanded premium rental prices. Tom Wilson, the property manager, was initially reluctant to discuss tenant information until I explained my situation and provided documentation proving my identity. The lease agreement showed my forged signature and listed employment at the same Seattle marketing firm mentioned in Isabella's credit applications. Wilson confirmed that the tenant had been living in Unit 2247 for approximately 3 months and had been an ideal resident with no complaints or late payments. The description Wilson provided of the tenant matched Isabella's appearance exactly. He mentioned her professional demeanor, her explanation about relocating from Portland for career advancement, and her apparent financial stability. She'd paid the security deposit and first 3 months' rent in advance, demonstrating the kind of financial resources that could only come from the credit she'd fraudulently obtained in my name. Wilson agreed to call me if he observed any unusual activity from the tenant, though he emphasized his obligation to respect resident privacy. I understood his position, but hoped he would contact me if Isabella attempted to extend her lease or made any statements about her future plans. The information would help determine whether she viewed this deception as temporary or permanent. The drive back to Portland gave me time to process the mounting evidence of Isabella's elaborate deception. She hadn't simply stolen my identity for quick financial gain. She'd created an entirely fabricated life using my credentials. The luxury apartment, the professional employment, the sophisticated financial management all suggested she intended to maintain this false identity indefinitely. That evening, I called our mother Carmen again, this time with more targeted questions about Isabella's recent behavior. I explained that I was concerned about her apparent isolation and wanted to reach out, but needed to know how to contact her current address or workplace. Carmen admitted she'd been worried as well, noting that Isabella had been evasive about her living situation and employment details. The conversation revealed additional troubling information. Isabella had asked Carmen for a loan 3 months earlier, claiming she needed money for a security deposit on a new apartment. Carmen had declined, explaining her own financial limitations, but Isabella had seemed unusually angry about the refusal. The timeline aligned perfectly with when Isabella would have been planning her identity theft scheme. Carmen also mentioned that Isabella had asked detailed questions about my career success, specifically about my salary, my apartment, and my general financial situation. At the time, Carmen had interpreted this as normal sibling curiosity, but in context, it appeared Isabella had been conducting reconnaissance for her planned deception. The systematic nature of her information gathering suggested she'd been planning this scheme for months before implementing it. The following day brought a call from Robert Kim with preliminary findings from his Seattle surveillance. He'd confirmed Isabella's presence at the Riverside Gardens apartment and had photographed her entering and leaving the building on multiple occasions. More significantly, he'd followed her to the offices of Sterling Marketing Solutions, The Yes Sir firm listed on her employment documentation, where she appeared to be maintaining regular working hours. Kim's photographs were devastating evidence of Isabella's deception. The images clearly showed my twin sister living the life she'd stolen from me, dressed in expensive clothing that my fraudulently obtained credit had undoubtedly purchased. Her confident demeanor in the photos suggested someone comfortable with her situation rather than guilty about her crimes. She appeared to be thriving using my stolen identity while I faced potential financial ruin. The employment verification proved even more troubling. Kim had spoken with contacts at Sterling Marketing Solutions and confirmed that they'd hired someone using my name and credentials approximately 3 months earlier. The employee had provided impressive portfolio samples and had interviewed exceptionally well, leading to a senior position with a substantial salary. Isabella was not only living in luxury using my credit, but was earning money using my professional reputation. This revelation added another layer of criminal activity to Isabella's scheme. She'd committed employment fraud by using my educational credentials and work experience to secure a position she wasn't qualified for. Worse, she was potentially damaging my professional reputation if her work performance was substandard, or if her eventual exposure led to questions about the authenticity of my actual qualifications. Kim recommended expanding the investigation to document Isabella's complete daily routine and financial activities. If she was indeed earning a legitimate salary while living on fraudulently obtained credit, this would demonstrate both her ability to repay the debt and her choice to continue the deception despite having alternatives. This information would be crucial if the case proceeded to prosecution. I authorized Kim to continue surveillance while I focused on understanding the full scope of the financial damage. Meeting with additional creditors and reviewing all account statements revealed that Isabella had been remarkably strategic in her fraud. She'd avoided the massive spending sprees that typically characterize identity theft, instead maintaining the appearance of responsible credit use while steadily accumulating substantial debt. The credit card statements showed purchases for professional clothing, high-quality furniture, and other items that supported her false lifestyle rather than frivolous luxury goods. This pattern suggested she'd been building a sustainable false identity rather than planning a quick cash grab. The implications were deeply disturbing. Isabella intended to continue living as me indefinitely. James Carter, the credit counselor, called again to schedule our next appointment for debt consolidation planning. I agreed to meet with him the following week, seeing an opportunity to gather additional information about Isabella's interactions with financial professionals. His detailed notes from their previous conversations would provide insight into her long-term plans and her confidence level about maintaining the deception. The legal consultation with Michael Harrison that week focused on the mounting evidence and potential prosecution strategies. The documented fraud was extensive enough to support multiple serious charges, including identity theft, credit fraud, employment fraud, and potentially tax evasion if Isabella hadn't been properly reporting her employment income. Harrison emphasized that the strength of the evidence made prosecution likely to succeed if I chose to proceed. However, Harrison also explained the personal costs of prosecution. Family member fraud cases often generated significant emotional trauma and permanent relationship damage. If Isabella was convicted, she would face substantial prison time and financial penalties that could follow her for decades. The decision to pursue criminal charges needed to consider not just legal justice, but the broader impact on family relationships. I requested time to consider my options while Kim continued gathering evidence. The investigation had confirmed my worst suspicions about Isabella's betrayal, but now I faced the more difficult decision about how to respond. Traditional prosecution would clear my name, but would likely destroy our family relationships and send my twin sister to prison for crimes motivated by desperation rather than malice. As I reviewed Kim's latest surveillance reports that evening, an alternative approach began forming in my mind. Isabella had created an elaborate false identity using my credentials, accumulated substantial debt in my name, and was apparently thriving in the life she'd stolen. What if instead of simply exposing her crimes, I could turn her own deception against her in a way that would achieve justice while avoiding the nuclear option of criminal prosecution. The idea was audacious and would require careful planning, but it offered the possibility of protecting myself financially while ensuring Isabella faced consequences proportional to her betrayal. Rather than being the victim of her scheme, I could become the architect of her comeuppance. The plan forming in my mind would require precise timing and flawless execution, but it would give Isabella exactly what she'd tried to take from me, a life filled with financial obligations she couldn't escape. Over the next several days, I refined this alternative strategy while Kim continued documenting Isabella's activities. The evidence was becoming overwhelming, but I was no longer focused simply on proving her guilt. Instead, I was developing a comprehensive plan that would expose her deception while simultaneously trapping her in the very prison she'd tried to create for me. Isabella wanted to live my life. She was about to discover that meant accepting all the responsibilities that came with it. The strategy crystallizing in my mind required meticulous preparation and perfect timing. Instead of simply exposing Isabella's crimes, I would orchestrate a complete reversal that would leave her legally responsible for every fraudulent transaction she'd made in my name. The plan was complex, but it offered something traditional. Prosecution couldn't guarantee absolute certainty that Isabella would face the full consequences of her choices, while I emerged completely free from financial liability. My first step involved consulting with Daniel Foster, a forensic accountant specializing in complex fraud cases. Daniel's office was located in a converted warehouse in the Pearl District, its modern interior reflecting his reputation for innovative approaches to financial investigations. His expertise in asset tracing and identity documentation would be crucial for the unconventional strategy I was developing. Daniel reviewed the evidence I'd gathered with professional fascination. He'd worked numerous identity theft cases, but the systematic nature of Isabella's deception impressed him from a technical standpoint. She'd demonstrated sophisticated understanding of credit systems, employment verification processes, and financial institution protocols. Her mistake, he noted, was assuming her victim would remain passive rather than conducting a thorough investigation. The forensic analysis Daniel proposed would establish a complete financial timeline of Isabella's activities, while simultaneously documenting my legitimate financial history during the same period. This parallel documentation would be essential for proving that two distinct individuals had been operating during the fraud period, even though they shared the same legal identity. The evidence would support my eventual claim that Isabella had assumed my identity so completely that she should bear legal responsibility for all associated obligations. Daniel explained that financial identity assumption cases had legal precedent. In situations involving divorce fraud and corporate identity theft, courts had previously ruled that individuals who voluntarily assumed another person's financial obligations through fraudulent means could be held legally responsible for those debts, particularly when the original identity holder could demonstrate they were unaware of and did not benefit from the fraudulent activities. The key to my strategy would be establishing clear documentation that Isabella had not simply used my identity for isolated transactions, but had comprehensively assumed my financial persona with the intent to maintain it permanently. The luxury apartment lease, the employment under my credentials, and the systematic debt management all supported the argument that she had effectively become me in every legal and financial sense. While Daniel began his forensic analysis, I focused on the next crucial element of my plan: comprehensive documentation of my actual activities during the period of Isabella's deception. This would require gathering evidence from my workplace, my actual residence, my legitimate financial accounts, and my daily activities to prove conclusively that I had been living my real life in Portland while someone else was living a fabricated version in Seattle. Ashley Thompson, my best friend since college, became an unwitting ally in this documentation process. I asked her to help me compile photographs, receipts, and other evidence of our shared activities over the past 3 months, explaining that I was organizing materials for a potential lawsuit related to identity theft. Ashley was shocked to learn about the fraud, but immediately offered to provide detailed testimony about my whereabouts and activities during the relevant time period. The evidence Ashley helped me gather painted a clear picture of my legitimate life during Isabella's deception. Credit card receipts from Portland restaurants where we'd shared meals, photographs from our regular hiking trips in the Columbia, River Gorge, even parking tickets from downtown Portland all established my continuous presence in Oregon, while Isabella was building her false life in Seattle. My workplace provided additional crucial documentation. Linda Brooks from Human Resources confirmed my continuous employment and provided detailed records of my attendance, project assignments, and client meetings. The timestamps on my electronic communications, security card access records, and even my computer login history all supported the evidence that I had been consistently present and working in Portland while someone else was using my identity in Seattle. Robert Kim's continued surveillance of Isabella provided increasingly detailed intelligence about her daily routine and long-term planning. His reports revealed that she had established a comprehensive social life in Seattle, developing friendships with coworkers and neighbors who knew her as Sofia Rodriguez. She'd even begun dating someone she'd met through her fraudulent employment, creating personal relationships based entirely on her stolen identity. The depth of Isabella's commitment to her false life was both impressive and disturbing. Kim's photographs showed her confidently participating in work events, social gatherings, and professional networking activities. She'd invested significant effort into maintaining her deception, suggesting she had no intention of voluntarily ending the fraud or returning to her actual identity. More troubling was Kim's discovery that Isabella had begun exploring permanent residency options in Seattle. She'd visited real estate offices to inquire about purchasing property and had made preliminary inquiries about transferring professional credentials between states. These activities indicated she was planning to make her stolen identity permanent rather than temporary. The real estate inquiries provided a crucial opportunity for my strategy. If Isabella was planning to purchase property using my stolen identity, she would need to provide extensive financial documentation and undergo detailed credit verification. This process would require her to appear before notaries, sign legal documents, and submit to verification procedures that would create an overwhelming paper trail of her voluntary assumption of my identity. I instructed Kim to monitor Isabella's real estate activities closely and to document any property viewings or mortgage applications. If she proceeded with attempting to purchase property, it would provide irrefutable evidence that she intended to permanently assume my identity rather than commit temporary fraud. This evidence would be essential for the legal strategy Daniel and I were developing. Meanwhile, I began implementing the more delicate aspects of my plan. The strategy required careful coordination with financial institutions, legal professionals, and documentation specialists to ensure every element would withstand legal scrutiny. The goal was to create a comprehensive legal framework that would effectively transfer all of Isabella's fraudulent obligations to her personally, while completely clearing my name and credit history. Michael Harrison initially expressed skepticism about my unconventional approach, noting that most identity theft cases followed predictable prosecution patterns. However, as I explained the legal precedents Daniel had researched and the comprehensive evidence we were gathering, he became increasingly intrigued by the strategy's potential effectiveness. The approach offered advantages over traditional prosecution by avoiding the uncertainty of criminal proceedings while achieving more comprehensive financial protection. Harrison agreed to research additional legal precedents for identity assumption cases and to begin drafting the preliminary documentation that would support my strategy. The legal framework would need to establish that Isabella had voluntarily and comprehensively assumed my identity with full knowledge of the associated financial obligations, making her legally responsible for all debts incurred during her deception. The complexity of this legal strategy required coordination with specialists in multiple areas of law. Harrison brought in colleagues with expertise in contract law, financial regulations, and identity documentation to ensure every aspect of the plan would be legally sound. The collaborative approach reflected the unprecedented nature of what we were attempting to accomplish. During this preparation phase, I maintained my normal routine at Northwest Marketing Solutions while secretly coordinating the investigation and legal strategy. My colleagues remained unaware of the personal crisis I was navigating, though Riley occasionally commented on my apparent distraction during client meetings. I assured her I was simply focused on a complex personal project that required significant attention to detail. The Morrison Group presentation I'd been preparing before discovering the fraud proceeded as scheduled, and I delivered it with the same professional competence my clients expected. The contrast between my public composure and private turmoil was stark, but maintaining normalcy was essential for both my career and my strategy. Any indication that I was dealing with financial difficulties could complicate the legal case I was building. 3 weeks into the preparation phase, Kim reported a significant development in Isabella's activities. She had submitted a formal mortgage application for a downtown Seattle condominium worth over $400,000. The mortgage application required extensive financial documentation, including tax returns, employment verification, and detailed credit history analysis. Isabella was voluntarily subjecting herself to the most comprehensive identity verification process available. The mortgage application was exactly the evidence we needed to prove Isabella's intent to permanently assume my identity. By applying for a major loan using my credentials, she was making a legal commitment that extended far beyond temporary fraud into permanent identity assumption. The documentation she provided to the mortgage company would establish her voluntary acceptance of all financial obligations associated with my identity. Daniel's forensic analysis of the mortgage application revealed Isabella's sophisticated understanding of financial documentation and credit management. She'd prepared meticulously for the verification process, creating supporting documentation that aligned with the false employment and residence history she'd established. The application represented months of careful planning rather than opportunistic fraud. More significantly, the mortgage application included Isabella's electronic signature on documents declaring her identity as Sofia Rodriguez and accepting legal responsibility for all associated financial obligations. These signatures, captured with timestamp and IP address verification, would provide irrefutable evidence that she had voluntarily assumed my identity with full legal knowledge of the implications. I instructed Kim to document every aspect of Isabella's mortgage application process, including photographs of her visiting the lending institution, copies of any documentation she provided, and records of her communications with mortgage brokers. This evidence would establish beyond doubt that she had voluntarily and knowingly assumed comprehensive legal responsibility for my financial identity. While Isabella was unknowingly providing the final pieces of evidence for my strategy, I began implementing the most crucial phase of the plan. This involved coordinating with multiple financial institutions to establish a new legal framework that would transfer all fraudulent obligations to Isabella personally while clearing my legitimate credit history completely. The process required extensive documentation proving my actual identity and demonstrating that I had been the victim of comprehensive identity assumption rather than simple fraud. Daniel's forensic analysis provided the foundation for this documentation, establishing clear timelines that showed two distinct individuals operating simultaneously under the same legal identity. I also needed to establish clear legal separation between my legitimate financial activities and Isabella's fraudulent ones. This required working with each creditor individually to demonstrate which transactions were legitimate and which were fraudulent, supported by comprehensive evidence of my actual whereabouts and activities during the relevant time periods. The coordination required for this strategy was extensive and demanded precise timing. Every financial institution needed to receive the same documentation simultaneously to prevent confusion or conflicting responses. Harrison's legal team prepared identical packages for each creditor, including forensic evidence, legal precedents, and clear instructions for transferring fraudulent obligations to Isabella personally. As the final preparations neared completion, I received an unexpected call from our mother, Carmen. She explained that Isabella had called her the previous evening, expressing unusual anxiety about her living situation and employment. Isabella had mentioned potential complications with her apartment lease and had asked whether she could return home temporarily, if needed. Carmen's concern was evident as she described Isabella's apparent distress. She seemed different, Carmen explained, less confident than usual and worried about financial pressures she wouldn't discuss in detail. Carmen asked if I knew anything about Isabella's situation, or if I'd spoken with her recently about potential problems. I assured Carmen that I hadn't spoken with Isabella recently, but suggested that financial stress could explain her apparent anxiety. I carefully avoided revealing my knowledge of Isabella's true situation while encouraging Carmen to maintain normal communication with both of us. The last thing I needed was family interference complicating the careful strategy I'd developed. Isabella's apparent anxiety suggested she might be experiencing pressure related to her mortgage application or other aspects of maintaining her false identity. The comprehensive verification process for major loans often revealed inconsistencies that raised questions about applicant identity and financial history. If Isabella was beginning to worry about exposure, it indicated my strategy was working as intended. That evening, I reviewed the complete documentation package Harrison's team had prepared for coordinating with creditors. The legal framework was comprehensive and sophisticated, establishing clear precedent for transferring fraudulent obligations to identity thieves who had voluntarily assumed comprehensive financial responsibility. Every aspect had been researched and verified to ensure the strategy would achieve its intended results. The timeline for implementation was carefully planned to coincide with Isabella's mortgage application processing. Once her loan was approved and she had committed to permanent assumption of my identity through property purchase, we would simultaneously notify all creditors of the identity theft and request transfer of all fraudulent obligations to Isabella, personally. The timing would leave her with no opportunity to escape responsibility or claim temporary fraud. As I prepared for the final phase of my strategy, I felt a complex mixture of anticipation and sadness. Isabella's betrayal had been comprehensive and calculating, but she was still my twin sister. The consequences she would face were severe and permanent, but they were also entirely the result of choices she had made deliberately and repeatedly, over several months. The plan I'd developed would achieve complete justice while avoiding the uncertainties of criminal prosecution. Isabella would face financial consequences that matched the scope of her deception, while I would emerge completely, cleared of all fraudulent obligations. Most importantly, she would be forced to live with the full reality of the life she'd stolen, rather than enjoying its benefits while leaving me to face its costs. Tomorrow would bring the final implementation of a strategy that had required months of careful planning and preparation. Isabella was about to discover that stealing someone's identity meant accepting complete responsibility for everything that came with it, including consequences she had never anticipated when she first decided to become me. The call came on a sigh. Thursday morning while I was reviewing quarterly reports at my desk. Robert Kim's voice carried an urgency I'd never heard before as he delivered news that would accelerate my carefully planned timeline by several days. Isabella's mortgage application had been approved, and she was scheduled to sign the final paperwork that afternoon at Cascade Financial Services in downtown Seattle. This development meant Isabella would legally commit to permanent assumption of my identity within hours, rather than the weeks I'd anticipated. The mortgage documents would include her sworn attestation that she was Sofia Rodriguez, accepting full legal responsibility for all financial obligations associated with that identity. Once those documents were signed and notarized, she would have voluntarily bound herself to every fraudulent debt she'd accumulated in my name. I immediately contacted Michael Harrison and Daniel Foster to confirm our readiness for immediate implementation. The coordination packages had been prepared weeks earlier, requiring only final authorization to send simultaneously to all relevant financial institutions. Harrison assured me that his legal team could execute the strategy within hours of Isabella's mortgage signing, ensuring she would have no opportunity to escape the consequences of her choices. Daniel's forensic documentation was comprehensive and irrefutable. The parallel timelines clearly established that two distinct individuals had been operating under my identity, with overwhelming evidence supporting my claim that Isabella had voluntarily assumed complete responsibility for all associated financial obligations. The mortgage signing would provide the final legal foundation needed to transfer every fraudulent debt directly to her. The timing was crucial, because mortgage fraud carried additional serious penalties beyond simple identity theft. By signing loan documents using stolen identity with clear intent to defraud the lending institution, Isabella would expose herself to federal charges that could result in decades of imprisonment. The evidence we'd gathered would support prosecution on multiple levels if she attempted to challenge the debt transfer. I took a personal day from Northwest Marketing Solutions, explaining to Riley that I had urgent family matters requiring immediate attention. The explanation was technically accurate, though she couldn't have imagined the true nature of the family situation I was addressing. My absence would allow me to coordinate the final implementation without workplace distractions. Kim's surveillance positioned him to photograph Isabella entering Cascade Financial Services at exactly 2:15 that afternoon. His real-time updates confirmed that she appeared confident and prepared, carrying a leather portfolio that presumably contained supporting documentation for her fraudulent identity. She'd dressed professionally in an expensive suit that my stolen credit had undoubtedly purchased, maintaining the sophisticated image she'd cultivated over months of deception. The mortgage signing process typically required 2 to 3 hours for final document review, verification, and notarization. This time frame would give Harrison's team sufficient opportunity to prepare final documentation while ensuring our coordinated response would reach all creditors before Isabella could realize her exposure and attempt damage control. At exactly 4:30, Kim confirmed that Isabella had completed the mortgage signing and left Cascade Financial Services with copies of her signed loan documents. She appeared relaxed and satisfied, stopping at a nearby coffee shop to make celebratory phone calls. Her demeanor suggested someone who believed she'd successfully secured permanent legitimacy for her stolen identity, rather than someone who'd just provided irrefutable evidence of comprehensive fraud. Harrison initiated our coordinated response immediately upon receiving Kim's confirmation. Identical documentation packages were transmitted simultaneously to 17 different creditors, including banks, credit card companies, the apartment complex, and Isabella's fraudulent employer. Each package contained comprehensive evidence of identity theft, along with legal demands for immediate transfer of all fraudulent obligations to Isabella Rodriguez personally. The documentation established that Isabella Rodriguez, twin sister of the legitimate account holder Sofia Rodriguez, had systematically and voluntarily assumed complete financial identity of her sister, with clear intent to maintain permanent deception. The mortgage documents signed that day provided irrefutable evidence of her voluntary commitment to comprehensive identity assumption, making her legally responsible for all associated obligations. Each creditor received detailed forensic evidence proving the systematic nature of Isabella's deception, including parallel timelines showing distinct individuals operating simultaneously, comprehensive documentation of Isabella's physical presence in Seattle while I remained in Portland, and clear evidence of her employment fraud and residential fraud. The legal framework demanded immediate recognition of Isabella as the responsible party for all fraudulent accounts. The mortgage loan documents were particularly damaging evidence because they included Isabella's sworn declaration of identity, her acknowledgement of financial responsibility, and her electronic signature confirming voluntary assumption of all legal obligations associated with the identity she claimed. Federal banking regulations made these declarations legally binding regardless of the circumstances that led to their execution. Within hours of Harrison's coordinated notification, responses began arriving from various creditors. The evidence we'd provided was so comprehensive and well documented that most institutions immediately initiated internal fraud investigations and began processes for transferring account responsibility. The parallel timeline evidence particularly impressed fraud investigators who noted the sophistication of our documentation. Pacific Northwest Credit Union responded first, confirming receipt of our documentation and acknowledging the compelling evidence of comprehensive identity assumption. Patricia Wells personally called to express amazement at the thoroughness of our investigation and to confirm that all fraudulent accounts would be transferred to Isabella Rodriguez within 48 hours. The bank's fraud department had never encountered such detailed evidence in an identity theft case. James Carter, the credit counselor Isabella had been working with, called in apparent confusion about conflicting identity claims. I explained the situation clearly, providing him with copies of our legal documentation and forensic evidence. His review of Isabella's previous communications revealed consistent acknowledgement of the debts as her responsibility and detailed discussions of repayment strategies that further supported our claim of voluntary assumption. The employment fraud at Sterling Marketing Solutions required separate handling due to the complexity of false credential usage. Daniel had prepared specific documentation for their human resources department, establishing that Isabella had fraudulently used my educational background and professional experience to secure employment she wasn't qualified for. The evidence included detailed comparisons of my actual transcripts and work history versus the falsified information Isabella had provided. Sterling Marketing's initial response was swift and severe. They immediately terminated Isabella's employment and initiated internal review of all work she'd completed using fraudulent credentials. The company's legal department expressed concern about potential liability for unknowingly employing someone using stolen professional credentials and requested copies of all our documentation for their internal investigation. The apartment complex management proved equally responsive to our evidence. Tom Wilson confirmed that Isabella would be held responsible for the full lease term and any associated penalties for fraudulent application. The lease documents included her sworn attestation of identity and financial responsibility, making her legally bound to all obligations regardless of how she'd obtained approval. By Friday morning, less than 24 hours after Isabella's mortgage signing, 14 of the 17 creditors had confirmed receipt of our documentation and initiated processes for transferring fraudulent account responsibility. The remaining 3 institutions requested additional verification procedures, but their initial responses indicated acceptance of our legal framework. The mortgage company's response was the most significant because of the substantial loan amount and the federal implications of mortgage fraud. Cascade Financial Services immediately froze the loan pending investigation and notified federal banking authorities about potential mortgage fraud. Isabella's sworn declarations in the loan documents provided irrefutable evidence for federal prosecution if they chose to pursue charges. During this coordinated implementation, I maintained normal communication with our mother Carmen, who remained unaware of the unfolding situation. Isabella had apparently not mentioned her mortgage application or employment termination, suggesting she was either unaware of the developing crisis or was attempting to manage it privately before involving family members. That evening brought the first direct communication from Isabella in over 6 months. Her text message was brief and carefully worded, asking if I was available for a phone conversation about important family matters. The neutral tone suggested she wasn't yet aware of the full scope of what had been set in motion, though she clearly suspected something significant was developing. I chose not to respond immediately, wanting to gauge the extent of her knowledge about the coordinated creditor notifications. Kim's continued surveillance revealed that Isabella had received multiple phone calls throughout the day and had appeared increasingly agitated with each conversation. Her confident demeanor from the mortgage signing had been replaced by obvious anxiety and frequent checking of her phone for additional messages. Friday evening brought confirmation that Isabella had indeed become aware of at least some creditor responses. Kim observed her making lengthy phone calls from her apartment balcony, gesturing animatedly in ways that suggested heated conversations. She'd also made multiple trips to her mailbox, suggesting she was expecting official correspondence about account transfers. The weekend provided time for additional creditor responses to arrive, while Isabella presumably attempted to understand and respond to what was happening. Kim's surveillance showed her remaining in her apartment for most of Saturday, making frequent phone calls and apparently researching options on her computer. Her isolation suggested someone trying to manage a crisis without external assistance. Sunday brought a more urgent text message from Isabella requesting immediate communication about serious financial matters affecting both of us. The message's tone indicated she'd gained better understanding of the coordinated response and was beginning to recognize the scope of what she faced. She suggested meeting in person to discuss complications that required family collaboration to resolve. I arranged to meet Isabella that Wednesday at Pike Place Market in Seattle, choosing a public location that would provide security while allowing for comprehensive discussion of her situation. The 5-day delay would give additional time for creditor responses to finalize while building pressure on Isabella to acknowledge the consequences of her choices. Harrison recommended bringing legal representation to any meeting with Isabella, noting that her awareness of the debt transfers might prompt her to make statements that could complicate our legal strategy. He offered to accompany me to ensure any conversation remained within legal boundaries, and that Isabella couldn't later claim coercion or misrepresentation about the debt transfer process. Daniel suggested preparing comprehensive documentation of Isabella's financial obligations for the meeting, including detailed accounting of all fraudulent debts, accumulated interest, and associated penalties. The documentation would help Isabella understand the full scope of what she'd voluntarily assumed through her identity theft and would establish clear expectations for her future responsibilities. By Monday, 16 of the 17 creditors had confirmed completion of debt transfers to Isabella Rodriguez personally. The coordination had been remarkably successful, with most institutions accepting our legal framework without significant challenge. The comprehensive evidence and clear legal precedents we'd provided eliminated doubt about Isabella's voluntary assumption of responsibility for all fraudulent obligations. The final creditor response arrived Tuesday morning, completing the debt transfer process. Isabella Rodriguez was now legally responsible for over $80,000 in fraudulent debt, plus a mortgage she couldn't afford, plus rental obligations she couldn't escape, plus employment termination that would make securing new income difficult. The life she'd stolen had become a prison she couldn't escape. My credit report, which I'd monitored carefully throughout the process, showed immediate improvement as fraudulent accounts were transferred away from my name. The parallel documentation Daniel had prepared clearly established my legitimate financial history while separating all of Isabella's fraudulent activities. For the first time in months, my financial identity was completely clean and accurate. Tuesday evening brought a desperate phone call from Isabella, her voice strained with barely controlled panic as she pleaded for immediate meeting to discuss what she called a massive misunderstanding about financial accounts. She insisted that mistakes had been made that required urgent correction, and that family loyalty demanded I help resolve the situation before it caused permanent damage to both of us. The irony of Isabella appealing to family loyalty was remarkable given her months of systematic betrayal, but I agreed to meet her the following day as planned. The conversation would provide opportunity to explain exactly what had happened and why she now faced complete responsibility for the consequences of her own choices. She'd wanted my life desperately enough to steal it completely. Now she would discover what accepting that life actually meant. Wednesday morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical Seattle weather that matched the somber nature of the confrontation ahead. Isabella had suggested meeting at a coffee shop near the market, but I insisted on the more public setting to ensure our conversation would be witnessed by neutral parties. The stakes were too high for private discussion that could later be misrepresented. As I drove toward Seattle for what would likely be our final conversation as sisters, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. Isabella's betrayal had been comprehensive and calculating, executed over months with sophisticated planning and ruthless disregard for family bonds. The response I'd developed had been equally systematic, turning her own deception against her, with surgical precision. The woman I was driving to meet was no longer my twin sister in any meaningful sense. She'd chosen to become someone else entirely, stealing my identity so completely that she'd legally bound herself to accept all consequences associated with that choice. Isabella Rodriguez now faced financial obligations that would follow her, for decades. Professional damage that would complicate future employment, and legal exposure that could result in criminal prosecution. The confrontation ahead would determine whether Isabella accepted responsibility for her choices with dignity, or attempted to manipulate family sympathy to escape consequences she'd created entirely through her own actions. Either response would change nothing about her legal obligations, but it would determine whether any relationship between us could survive her comprehensive betrayal of trust and family loyalty. I spotted Isabella immediately among the crowd, at Pike Place Market, her expensive clothing and anxious posture making her stand out against the casual atmosphere of tourists and vendors. She looked thinner than I remembered, her face drawn with stress that expensive makeup couldn't quite conceal. When our eyes met across the bustling marketplace, I saw recognition mixed with desperation that confirmed she understood at least some of what had happened. She approached cautiously, her usual confident stride replaced by hesitant steps that suggested someone walking toward an execution rather than a family reunion. The woman who had stolen my identity with such calculated precision now appeared fragile and uncertain, stripped of the false confidence that had sustained her elaborate deception for months. "Sophia," she said quietly as she reached me, her voice carrying none of the warmth that typically characterized our family interactions. "Thank you for coming. We need to discuss what's happening with these financial accounts. There's been some kind of massive error that's affecting both of us." I gestured toward a nearby bench overlooking Elliott Bay, choosing a spot where our conversation would be private but still within sight of other people. Isabella followed reluctantly, clutching her purse with white knuckles that betrayed her nervousness, despite her attempts to maintain composure. "There's no error, Isabella," I said calmly as we sat down. "Everything that's happening is exactly what was intended. You've been legally recognized as the person responsible for all the financial obligations you created while pretending to be me." Her face went pale as the full implications of my statement registered. She'd clearly hoped this meeting would involve negotiating some kind of resolution or appealing to family loyalty for assistance. Instead, she was learning that her situation was permanent and legally binding. "I don't understand what you mean," she stammered, though her expression suggested she understood perfectly. "These are your accounts, your credit cards, your apartment lease. There must be some way to fix this confusion before it damages both our credit histories." I removed a folder from my bag containing copies of all the evidence we'd compiled over the past months. The documentation was comprehensive, from surveillance photographs to financial records to legal precedents supporting debt transfer in identity assumption cases. Isabella's eyes widened as she recognized images of herself, conducting fraudulent transactions and living the life she'd stolen. "This is documentation proving that you systematically stole my identity and voluntarily assumed complete responsibility for all associated financial obligations," I explained matter-of-factly. "When you signed that mortgage application Monday, using my credentials, you legally bound yourself to accept every debt you'd accumulated in my name." Isabella's hands shook as she flipped through the evidence, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. The mortgage documents were particularly damaging because they included her sworn attestation of identity and financial responsibility, witnessed and notarized according to federal banking regulations. "You can't do this," she whispered, her voice breaking with panic. "I'm your sister. We can work together to fix this situation. I never meant for things to get so complicated." "You spent months planning this deception," I replied, maintaining calm while she dissolved into desperation. "You researched my financial history, practiced my speech patterns, and created an entire false life using my stolen identity. Every choice you made was deliberate and calculated. She began crying then, tears streaming down her face as the full scope of her situation became clear. The confident woman who had stolen my life and lived in luxury for months was confronting the reality that her scheme had trapped her in financial obligations she couldn't escape. I was desperate, she sobbed. My career in Los Angeles was failing. I couldn't afford my rent, and everything was falling apart. I saw how successful you were and thought I could borrow your identity temporarily until I got back on my feet. Borrowing implies intent to return what you've taken, I observed. You applied for a mortgage to purchase property permanently. You established employment under my credentials. You created a comprehensive false life with no plan to return to your actual identity. Isabella's attempts at justification crumbled as she confronted evidence of her long-term planning and permanent intentions. The mortgage application alone demonstrated that she'd intended to maintain her stolen identity indefinitely rather than resolve her temporary financial difficulties through legitimate means. "What happens now?" she asked finally, her voice hollow with resignation. "Am I going to prison? Will I lose everything?" I explained that criminal prosecution remained a possibility if creditors chose to pursue charges, particularly given the federal implications of mortgage fraud. However, the debt transfer process we'd implemented provided an alternative that achieved justice while avoiding the complexities of criminal proceedings. You're now legally responsible for $83,000 in debt, plus a mortgage you can't afford, plus rental obligations you can't escape, I summarized. Your employment has been terminated for credential fraud, and your professional reputation has been damaged in ways that will complicate future job searches. The numbers seemed to hit her like physical blows, each obligation another weight added to a burden that would follow her for decades. She'd enjoyed the luxury lifestyle that fraudulent credit could provide, but now she faced the crushing reality of the financial obligations she'd created. "I can't possibly pay all of this," she said desperately. "The monthly payments alone are more than I could ever earn. You're condemning me to financial ruin for the rest of my life." "You condemned yourself when you chose to steal my identity systematically over several months," I replied. "Every credit card you opened, every purchase you made, every day you spent living in that luxury apartment was a choice to accept these obligations." Isabella's face cycled through anger, desperation, and finally a kind of broken acceptance as she realized the completeness of her situation. She'd gambled everything on maintaining her deception permanently and had lost catastrophically when her scheme was exposed and turned against her. "Is there anything I can do?" she asked quietly. "Any way to negotiate or reduce these obligations?" I explained that the debts were now legally hers through voluntary assumption, but that bankruptcy might provide eventual relief if she could demonstrate inability to pay. However, the mortgage fraud and employment fraud could complicate bankruptcy proceedings and might result in criminal charges that would follow her regardless of financial resolution. "The life you stole came with responsibilities you weren't prepared to accept," I noted. "You wanted the luxury apartment, the professional position, the financial freedom, but you didn't want the obligations that made those things possible." We sat in silence for several minutes as Isabella processed the magnitude of her situation. The bustling marketplace continued around us, tourists and vendors conducting normal business, while her world collapsed into financial and legal ruin. She'd created entirely through her own choices. "What about our family?" she asked eventually. "Does Mom know what happened?" I explained that I hadn't told our mother about Isabella's crimes, preferring to let Isabella decide how much family involvement she wanted in her situation. However, the employment termination and mounting financial pressure would likely make concealing her circumstances impossible. "She's going to find out eventually," Isabella said with bitter resignation. "I'll have to move back home, declare bankruptcy, and explain how I destroyed my life by stealing my sister's identity." The conversation concluded with Isabella asking for copies of the debt documentation so she could understand her full obligations and explore her limited options. I provided her with comprehensive financial statements showing exactly what she now owed and when payments would be due. As we prepared to part ways, Isabella made one final appeal for mercy or assistance. The desperation in her voice was genuine, but it came months too late to matter. She'd had numerous opportunities to confess her crimes and seek help legitimately, but had chosen to deepen her deception instead. "I hope someday you can forgive me," she said as we stood to leave. "I know I destroyed our relationship along with everything else, but you're still my sister." I looked at her for a long moment, seeing not my twin sister but a stranger who had stolen my identity so completely that she'd legally become responsible for all consequences of that choice. Whatever relationship we'd once shared had been sacrificed when she decided my life was worth stealing. "Isabella Rodriguez is responsible for these debts," I said finally. "Sofia Rodriguez had nothing to do with creating them. You wanted to be me so badly that you legally became me. Now, you get to live with everything that means." 6 months later, I received news through our mother that Isabella had indeed filed for bankruptcy and moved back home to Beaverton. The luxury lifestyle she'd built using my stolen identity had collapsed completely, leaving her with damaged credit, limited employment prospects, and legal obligations that would follow her for years. Meanwhile, my own life had returned to normal and then surpassed it. The promotion I'd been working toward at Northwest Marketing Solutions came through, recognizing both my professional competence and my ability to handle complex personal challenges with grace. My relationship with Daniel Foster had evolved beyond professional collaboration into something personal and meaningful. The house I purchased in the Pearl District was entirely mine, financed through legitimate credit that reflected my actual financial history. Every piece of furniture, every decoration, every detail represented choices I'd made using resources I'd earned through my own efforts rather than stolen opportunities. Sometimes I wondered if Isabella truly understood that her punishment hadn't been imposed by me, but had been the natural consequence of her own choices. She'd wanted my life desperately enough to steal it completely, and in doing so had legally bound herself to accept all the responsibilities she'd never considered. The identity she'd stolen had become a prison she couldn't escape, exactly as it should be. Isabella Rodriguez would spend years paying for the life she'd briefly enjoyed using someone else's name, learning too late that stealing someone's identity meant accepting everything that came with it. The lesson was simple but profound. When you steal someone's life completely enough, that life becomes yours to keep, including all the obligations you never wanted to face. Isabella had gotten exactly what she'd tried to take from me, and I'd made sure she would keep it forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.